on debate. Senator Carr.
Honorable colleagues, I rise today to speak from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people, in enthusiastic support of Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 2 years ago, I rose to speak in support of a similar bill, Bill C-262, which had been introduced and championed by former Member of Parliament Romeo Saganash. I was honored at that time to be a member of the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, then chaired by our esteemed former colleague, Senator Lillian Dick. And I am now honored to be a member of the same committee, capably chaired by my Nova Scotia colleague, Senator Dan Christmas. On that day 2 years ago, many of us had attended an historic smudging ceremony in the then new Senate chamber, graciously conducted by Algonquin elder Claudette Commanda. At that smudging ceremony, Elder Commanda gently and firmly reminded each of us to use our wisdom, courage, love, and strength to work with each other and with kindness for the benefit of all peoples of Canada. Colleagues, I'm pleased to report that 2 years after my deep disappointment and frankly shame at this upper house not allowing the former UNDRIP related bill to come to a vote after having passed in our committee, I was so pleased to see how respectfully, wisely, and cohesively our Aboriginal Peoples Committee worked together to bring you Bill C-15, unamended, but well vetted and with observations. In my speech of 2 years ago, I said, and I quote, "We've already heard from our own in-house Indigenous rights expert, legal scholar, truth teller, and reconciliation seeker, Senator Sinclair, on the importance of that bill. Its historical background, the strong case for getting on with righting the centuries of wrongs our country and its citizens have committed against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada. And of course, the case for then moving forward with a new relationship based on mutual respect and sincerity. While we sorely miss our former colleague, Senator Sinclair, we are fortunate to have our dedicated colleagues, Senators Laboucan Benson and Patterson, acting as sponsor and critic, respectively, on Bill C-15. As we have heard, it wasn't until 1982 that the international community formally established the Working Group on Indigenous Populations to develop the minimum standards that would protect Indigenous peoples and their rights. It is estimated that there are 370 million Indigenous people from 5,000 groups living in 90 countries worldwide, with approximately 1.7 million of those people living here in Canada. The UN Declaration defines the minimum standards necessary for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. The international community saw the adoption of an Indigenous-specific human rights instrument as necessary. We know that Indigenous people still live with the consequences of colonialism, and there is an ongoing struggle to have some of their most basic human rights respected, including in Canada, as we are painfully aware. The UN Declaration preamble recognizes that Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples and should be free from discrimination, that they have suffered historic injustices, and that there's an urgent need to recognize their inherent rights. Urgent need. The Declaration's 46 articles do not create new rights. To remind us, among other things, the articles affirm that Indigenous peoples have the right to the full enjoyment of their human rights as individuals and collectives, the right to self-determination, autonomy, and self-government, the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct institutions, the right to not be subjected to forced assimilation or cultural destruction, the right to practice and revitalize their cultures, customs, and spiritual traditions, the right to participate in decision-making in matters affecting their rights, and to be consulted in good faith on legislative and administrative measures that may affect them. The right to own, use, develop, and control their lands, territories, and resources. The right to give their free, prior, and informed consent on matters affecting them, and the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property. Article 46(1) of the Declaration limits the rights embedded within UNDRIP so that they cannot infringe on the sovereignty of states. Colleagues, Bill C-15 is a short, high-level bill intended to provide a framework to advance the Government of Canada's implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The preamble sets out the context of the bill and was amended to include references to racism and systemic racism, the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and to indicate that Section 35 rights are not frozen but are rather capable of evolution and growth. To remind us, the purposes of the Act are to affirm the Declaration as a universal human rights instrument with application in Canadian law and provide a framework for the Government of Canada's implementation of the Declaration. The Act requires measures to be taken over time to ensure that federal laws are consistent with the Declaration. It does not bind provincial or territorial governments. Further, it requires the minister to develop and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the Declaration in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. It must include measures to tackle violence, racism, and discrimination against Indigenous peoples, including systemic racism and discrimination. Measures to promote understanding through human rights education, measures to ensure accountability with respect to implementation of the Declaration. And the Act requires the preparation and completion of the action plan as soon as practicable, but no later than 2 years after the day of coming into force. Honourable colleagues, we have already heard from Senators Christmas and Laboucan Benson about the work our Aboriginal Peoples Committee undertook to study this bill. The 89 witnesses we heard from, the 46 written briefs we received, and the in-depth discussions we had among ourselves, using our sober second thought, considering possible amendments and observations. We are all aware of the scrutiny of this bill among all of us in Canadian society and, of course, widely in our media. Colleagues, I would like to quote Member of Parliament and former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould from her article in the April 24th, 2021 edition of the Globe and Mail newspaper. MP Wilson-Raybould said, and I quote, "Amazingly, the debate around Bill C-15 continues to remain incoherent, just as it has been in the past. At the same time we hear the bill is too strong in upholding Indigenous rights, in particular achieving free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Some conservative and industry voices. The bill is colonialist and racist and will further oppress Indigenous peoples. Some Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists, experts, and community voices. And finally, the bill must be passed and sets a foundation for decolonization. Most Indigenous advocates, experts, leaders, and community voices, as well as many allies. But is Bill C-15 any of the things these groups say it is?" And she goes on to say, "No, it certainly does not entrench the status quo, but neither does it shatter it. It is a small step forward that will require significantly more legislative, policy, and practice changes for it to truly address our legacy of colonialism." End of quote. Closer to home, I would like to quote excerpts from Regional Chief for Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, Paul Prosper's written submission to our Aboriginal Peoples Committee. And I quote, "First Nations widely supported Bill C-262, the proposed implementation legislation on which Bill C-15 is closely based. First Nations have widely endorsed the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which called for the implementation of the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. First Nations also supported the calls for justice of the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which again called for the implementation of the UN Declaration." Chief Prosper goes on to say, "I would like to emphasize 3 things about Bill C-15. The first is that the bill provides much needed clarity that Canada is fully committing to upholding the UN Declaration, not just in words, but in actions. The second is that the bill will establish a legal commitment to working together with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to operationalize the UN Declaration in ways that will make a real difference to the health and well-being of our communities. The third is that the bill includes an explicit commitment to working together to end all forms of racism, discrimination, and violence. In my view, this is urgent and indeed long overdue. We know there is a lot of hard work ahead of all of us to build better relationships, to honor the treaties, and to work toward reconciliation. I am anxious to see Bill C-15 passed into law as a critical tool to ensure that this work is carried out and carried out in the right way. That's the end of Chief Prosper's quote. Also supportive of the bill in their written submission to the House Committee are the women of the Métis Nation. And they said, and I quote, "Elders and representatives from across the Métis motherland have noted that this historic piece of legislation, if implemented according to its spirit and intent, could have the transformative power of a Canadian Indigenous Bill of Rights. Bill C-15, the proposed UNDRIP Act, represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reset both the scales of justice and the balance of power, so that Indigenous women, children, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people are protected, safe, and free." In his third reading speech, Senator Klein reminded us that Bill C-15 did not originate as a benevolent proposal of government. Rather, this legislation is the product of decades of Indigenous grassroots struggle and advocacy, political organization, litigation, demonstrations, commissions, inquiries, survival testimonials, and incremental wins. Senator Laboucan Benson stated in her third reading speech, "Passing Bill C-15 is about honoring the leaders of the 1970s who began this process of reclaiming basic human rights for Indigenous people." Former Grand Chief of the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, former Member of Parliament, lawyer, residential school survivor, and international Indigenous rights champion Willie Littlechild was one such leader. These brave and persistent leaders were following in the much earlier footsteps of Cayuga Chief Deskehe of the Iroquois Nation, who in 1923, yes, 1923, was the first to come to the League of Nations to assert the rights of his people. Almost 100 years of struggle. Honorable Senators, let's demonstrate to these leaders that their unrelenting struggle and diligent work to right the wrongs of the past, to protect future generations of Indigenous children, and to forge a healthy path forward for their families and communities is something that we respect and sincerely honor. Honorable colleagues, in passing Bill C-15, my sincere hope is that we can transform our relationships with Indigenous peoples to ones based on trust and mutual respect, and that we can find new and better ways to work together to lay the foundations for a Canada where the original peoples of this bountiful nation not only take their chosen place at the table, a table of their creation and choice, but also that they flourish in every way, physically, spiritually, socially, culturally, economically, and politically. Colleagues, it is time for this new Canada. Let's pass Bill C-15 and get on board. Wilalio, thank you, merci.